Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It is truly a delight to be with you all today, and really an honor for our Advocacy and Social Justice Talk Story series, where we explore organized efforts and mechanisms for social change. Today's topic is on discovering conflict, finding peace, and community stories of World War II with Dr. Gail Okawa, Allison Kaoli no Kaimana, Yasuoka, and moderated by myself. 83 years ago have passed since December 7th, 1941. How do slogans like Remember Pearl Harbor leave out all the other stories connected to what happened on that date, even within our own families? Unless there was someone who shared the stories about that day, some of the details are being lost. Some families are completely unaware that an Issei family member was unjustly incarcerated in U.S. concentration camps. The trauma and shame they experienced led ancestors to take their stories with them. So, how do oral stories and storytelling uncover these stories of conflict? We'll be going a little bit deeper into that with our two speakers today, and how to sharing our stories with one another bring forth resolution, closure, peace, or inspiration. So thank you for joining us with author Gail Kawa, who shares about how a neighbor opened the door to her Issei grandfather's experience, leading to her research decades later. How did Gail's research lead her to uncover countless other community stories that go beyond Remember Pearl Harbor? As well as how did storytelling help Allison discover her great grandfather's grandmother and grandfather's mothers and aunts' parts in the story? And how does Allison's son, a great great grandchild, become involved in the story? How can these stories reveal the layered truths of the day? Why is it important in helping to tear down the walls of hate, racism, and misunderstanding that make us live on this day? Our first, well, I'm going to give a little bio about our wonderful speakers. Dr. Gail Kawa is a professor emerita of English from Youngstown State University, Ohio, a visiting scholar, um, Center for Biographical Research, scholar in residence to the Asian Pacific American Program, Smithsonian Institution, author remembering our grandfather's exile. I will put the link to that in the chat a little later, and it'll also be in the summary in the recording for this, so folks can pick that up as well, which is about U.S. imprisonment of Hawaii's Japanese in World War II. Kinetic coordinator of Connections, a Santa Fe internment camp descendants group. Dr. Okawa's book was inspired by questions raised by the internment of her grandfather, Reverend Tamasaku Watanabe, the minister of Ola'a Japanese Christian Church. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, her grandfather was among those Japanese in Hawaii who were arrested immediately after the Harbor attack and justly held captive in U.S. in the War Department camps scattered in remote locales across the US mainland, including New Mexico. Based on years of research on the experiences of individuals from Hawaii, Dr. Kawa's book tells the internees' stories through firsthand accounts, letters, poetry, and other personal and official documents that reveal the oppressive conditions that they experienced during the war, even as their sons fought and died for the United States, in Europe, and the Pacific, and how they resisted and persevered. Allison, who's our other speaker, ōlinokaimana Yasuoka is a master's candidate in University here of Hawaii at Manoa's Curriculum Studies, the STEM 2 program, working towards earning a graduate certificate in sustainability and resilience education. She is an educator who believes in educational access to holistic learning opportunities that weave together culture, place, language, science, history, reading, writing, and the arts, empowering students' lives and amplifying students' voices. She is committed to building relationships with communities that support the health, well-being, and sustainability of Aina and community. And it is truly a treat to have them both with us today. And to get us started, I'm going to turn it to Dr. Gail Okawa, who will um, introduce us to her set of presentation about her story, which is titled Legacies. Well, I'm going to help. Are you able to do the shared screen? I just want to make sure, Dr. Okawa. There you go. Legacies and Inheritance, despite the many infamies of December 7th, 1941. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Okawa. Thank you.
Well, aloha, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And many thanks to Jose for coordinating the Zoom Talk Story event. I'm not very good with the technology, so I hope you will bear with me. Um, I thought I was going to get another screen, but apparently I can't. Okay, to understand some of my current thoughts on the legacies and inheritances related to tomorrow's anniversary, I'll start with the first process in our title, Discovering Conflict, then move on to the second, Finding Peace. So discovering conflict, and conflict includes violence, violation, injustice, insult, and so on. For me, this journey begins with ignorance, first recognized in childhood, which remained latent until later adulthood, with a subsequent quest over 20 plus years to learn what happened. Sometime in my adolescence, so really ancient history, in 1950s Hawaii, when I was learning about the World War II incarceration of American Japanese on the West Coast, I mentioned this to a neighbor, a trusted auntie. Only then did I learn from her that my maternal grandfather, Reverend Tamasaku Watanabe, had been interned by the US government in concentration camps during World War II. I was shocked, but when I went home to question my parents, they only acknowledged that he had been interned and returned a changed man, in quotes, and said no more. And those were the days when kids were to be seen, not heard. 40 years later, in the 1990s, and years after his death, while going through my grandfather's possessions carefully stored in an old trunk, I found this lone, unidentified photo among letters and documents that seemed related to his internment. My mother recognized her father in the third row, but that's all we knew. It wasn't until fall, okay, let's see. It wasn't until fall 2001 that I developed a sabbatical research project on my grandfather's World War II internment, proposed coincidentally around 9/11, another external attack on the US like Pearl Harbor, making past history suddenly relevant. It started as a biography on Reverend Watanabe. He had immigrated at age 22 from Hiroshima, Japan, to San Francisco in 1905, was baptized as a Christian there, and after witnessing the great San Francisco earthquake, was inspired to study the Christian ministry. Here he is with some Christians of the time. He married and started a family in California, but was recruited to serve in the Hawaiian Islands, where he was first assigned to Maui. And I don't know if you can see him up at the top, in the top row, Wailuku Japanese Christian Church, and then transferred to Ola'a on Hawaii Island. It was at his parsonage here where he was seized on December 7th, 1941. But we knew little about his life during the war years. Through several turns of events detailed in my book that I don't have time to relate here, the project expanded from one man's biography to a community biography. For one thing, my formal research had started in 2002 when I served as a scholar in residence in the Asian Pacific American program at the Smithsonian Institution, and spent months examining files at the National Archives. Although I began searching through files on Reverend Watanabe, I found them in these 5 record groups. When I requested any file, I often got a cartload of file boxes on hundreds of Japanese immigrants in the same record group. So this is the difference between in-person versus online research. This reinforced the broader story for me, the reality of nearly 700 other Hawaii Issei whose files were in these archival boxes with my grandfathers, who had been arrested and incarcerated along with him, and the narrower story of the Hawaii men sent to the mainland camps, treated by the government as a discrete group. So, among other things, I began to understand the scope of the injustice in concrete human terms. Eventually, I learned that these men were my grandfather's barrack mates in the Santa Fe internment camp. All had their individual and family stories, as did these men who were shipped out on Transfer Boat 3 with him from Sand Island to Angel Island. And there he is in the second row. In Washington, D.C., and especially when I moved my research to Hawaii, one story led to another, one contact led to others. So archival research, essentially paper, eventually expanded to in-person interviews with 4 internee survivors from their mid-80s to 100 years old, and 32 descendant families involving over 40 Nisei and Sansei children. These stories revealed a more complete narrative, not the whole narrative, but a more complete narrative, what I call the many infamies of December 7th, 1941. So on December 7th, 1941, not only was Pearl Harbor attacked, altering the course of thousands of lives, the war, and US history, but many Japanese men, but many Japanese men in Hawaii, like my grandfather, were suddenly arrested and taken from their families on that day, altering their lives. Fathers and grandfathers disappeared over 2 months before Executive Order 9066 affected the West Coast Japanese. I was shocked to learn that the government was prepared, despite claims of surprise. The FBI had begun a collaboration with the US Army 5 months earlier. They had camps set up, as you can see here, and they had plans and names, lists of names. They also had anti-Japanese immigration laws and attitudes. Legal Japanese immigrants were outlawed from US citizenship and remained aliens. When war was declared with Japan on December 8th, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, their immigration status changed instantly to alien enemy. As I said, this was simply an immigration status. In Hawaii, they targeted mainly community leaders. And this is also a complicated story in my book, how they ended up with this targeted group. But just as examples, there were clergy such as Reverend Odate from a Buddhist minister. Reverend Odate, a Buddhist minister. I'm using my cursor. I don't know if you can see this. Jose, can you see my cursor pointing at different people?
No, actually, we can't.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah.
Um, well, anyway, he's in the lower right-hand corner, Reverend Odate from Kauai, and my grandfather, Reverend Watanabe from the Big Island.
We can see your cursor now.
Oh, you can? Okay, good. There were Japanese school principals and teachers such as Mr. Hirano from the Big Island and Mr. Miho from Maui. Attorneys such as Mr. Kawasaki from the Big Island, businessmen like Mr. Otani and Mr. Tokaiden and Mr. Ida from Oahu, and shopkeepers like Mr. Ishida from Oahu and Mr. Matsumoto from Kauai. So even in my study, there were 15 Issei who were arrested on December 7th. So the there's a few examples. I'll just give you a few examples of those arrests. Reverend Watanabe was arrested in his parsonage on that Sunday morning in Ola. We have no other information, no other details. We can only imagine how shocking and humiliating it was for him. But the warrant for his arrest shows that rather than for a crime, he is arrested on suspicion of being an alien enemy, which, as sinister as it sounds, as I said before, was simply an immigration status. Talking to internee survivors and family members, I learned of others' fates on December 7th and following. Mr. Hirano was arrested on the Big Island, as I mentioned, along with Reverend Watanabe. In fact, and he was a member of my grandfather's church, and his granddaughter Naomi is in the audience, and I hope she will be able to share some stories that she heard as she was growing up about him. On Oahu, Mr. Tokairen, a small hotel owner, had become a leader in the Japanese community, serving on the board of the Japanese Charity Hospital, which is now Kuakini Medical Center, and as president of the Honolulu Inn Association. On December 7th, he was fearful that both he and his son, who served in the 100th Battalion, would be killed because they were Japanese. Mr. Otani was a businessman and arrested in his yukata. He had immigrated from a fishing village in Japan when he was 18 and had developed a good business in Hawaii, in Honolulu. On December 7th, his son Akira told me, the FBI and military came to his home. The agent pointed a gun at him, pulled him roughly to his feet, and began to shove him into the car without allowing him to change his clothes. Fortunately, his wife threw his coat and shoes into the car before they drove off. What happened to them after their arrest? The Hawaii Issei internment journey in Department of Justice and Army camps is quite different from that of the WRA camp incarceration, and should not be confused or equated with those experiences. Just as an example, the Big Island Issei, like those in my squiggly, designated by my squiggly blue circles, these Big Island Issei were detained at the Kilauea military camp with other Hawaii Issei. This group included my grandfather in the lower right corner. But these men were all detained at the Kilauea military camp. Let's see, that slide's not, here we go. This is a drawing by George Hoshida, who accompanied them. But they were then shipped to the Honolulu They were then, prisoners like Reverend Watanabe were given hearings, which were really interrogations at the Hilo Federal Building. And then they were shipped to the immigration station where officials took their mugshots, then were sent to the Sand Island internment camp, where in my grandfather's case, the original order for release, which was signed by a civilian board, this order for release was reversed by the intelligence board. And you can see the signatures of Robert Shivers and the Naval and Army intelligence officials. But at the very bottom of the screen, I hope you can see that it says, it appearing necessary, it is ordered that Tamasaku Watanabe be interned. So he and hundreds of other Hawaii Issei were interned, not for specific wrongdoing, but it appearing necessary. Then they were exiled due to convoluted political reasons, which I discuss in the book. Nearly 700 Hawaii internees were shipped to the mainland, sent on 10 transfer boats at different times, beginning on February 20th, 1942. And these maps, which I compiled after gathering the many stories that I was able to find, these maps document their exile from their families and homes. Basically, there were 4 major routes ending in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I hope you can see that on the bottom map. All of them eventually converged on Santa Fe, New Mexico. And there were different smaller groups who were transported later and may have gone to on slightly different routes. And I'm still learning about them. The third transfer boat with these men, shown earlier with my grandfather, sailed on May 23rd, 1942, and arrived at Angel Island on June 1st. And my grandfather's itinerary, I call it his incarceration log, verifies that travel route from KM. So this is in his writing, from Kilauea military camp to the immigration station, Sand Island, Angel Island, Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, to Lurdsburg in southern New Mexico, and finally to Santa Fe in northern New Mexico. And a lot of this is detailed out in not only in my book, but in other talks that I've given. But we had basically no description from my grandfather about his journey. We did not find a journal or a diary about this period in his life. But I was able to cobble things together through other people's descriptions. Not until over 40 years later did the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 admit that their incarceration was caused by racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. It was a violation, a deep injustice that our grandfathers had to endure. The mistreatment that they endured involved such forms of violence as I have listed here, in spite of the Geneva Convention's assurance of humane treatment. And we, their descendants, need to understand this. It was a very troubling discovery to learn of the kinds of violence that they had to either witness or endure. With all this, is it possible to find peace? Peace for whom? Without pretending to be comprehensive, I gathered stories, documents, and photos shared by internee survivors and the internees' families to create a narrative of what happened to my grandfather and his fellow internees. Discovering that they survived, that they resisted, that they sought peace. So these are their legacies and our inheritances. I want to assure you that the prisoners from Hawaii and others did everything they could to survive and resist what Mr. Hirano referred to as barbed wire disease. And this is what he wrote in one of his notes, in a note in a folder that his family showed me. It has been said that an internee is most likely to succumb to the discouragement and depression known as barbed wire disease. To keep myself out of the disease, I'm participating in many activities at this camp. Excuse me. So to understand those many activities, I borrowed a template of a psychologist named John Laffin, who describes how long-term captives often employ universal human strategies to cope with the deprivation of freedom and the malaise of boredom, strategies that the internees adapted to their culture and practices as Hawaii Japanese. So these are just a few examples, and I'll refer only to a few of them. But overall, you can see these strategies: the physically creative, the physically active, the intellectual, the imaginative, and I added the spiritual and ritual to Laffin's list. Here are just a few examples. George Hoshida gave us, or has left us with, perhaps the best visual documentation of life, the Issei and Hawaii Issei internees' lives in the camps. He provided us with portraits, such as this one of my grandfather, and sketches of different ordinary, everyday events in the camps. Mr. Nakagawa, whom I have learned since my book was published, was on the same transfer boat as my grandfather, surprised his family with his beautiful artwork. They were unaware that he was an artist. And I wanted to mention Mr. Matsumoto, who I interviewed when he was 100 years old, because the craft that he showed me and actually gave me some of these pieces is an extraordinary example of craftsmanship. This is something he learned when he was a child in Hiroshima, but when he was in Camp Livingston, Louisiana, he gathered these longleaf pine needles, somehow braided them into these long strips, and then these are all plaited, these are not woven, and then stitched them together into these incredible purses. The purse at the top is actually the size of a small briefcase. And he actually gave this to me, and I'm trying to find a home for it with a museum. He was very active and had a number of photos of sports activities that he was involved in, such as the baseball team at Missoula, but the Issei also participated in sumo and in theater performances. And Mr. Matsumoto actually played the part of an onagata, a woman in a Japanese theater, as you can see here. But the intellectual strategy was very, very widely employed by these internees, because they were both educated and highly intellectual. So there are many, many examples of letters, journals, and Mr. Kawasaki's scrapbook actually was one of the most useful tools for my creating the narrative of their lives in the camps, because at one point, you can see him here, at one point he was elected to be the spokesperson among the Issei, so he had an official capacity, and he obviously had a typewriter because he kept typewritten notes, which is wonderful for a researcher. But one of the most, I would guess, I guess I would call this my major find, one of my major finds, was this group petition from about 200 Hawaii Issei asking to be returned to Hawaii. They were willing to stay incarcerated, but they just wanted to go home. And this was in February 1944, so they had already been incarcerated for many years, separated from their families for many years. But what was so incredible about this, finding this document in the archives, was that there were signatures by these 200 or so Issei men, and I was able to find my grandfather's signature at the bottom of the page, and also Allison's great-grandfather's signature up here at the top of the page. So there's something about seeing the actual signatures of our ancestors that can be extremely touching and rewarding. Because there were many photos of smaller and larger gatherings. I found many photos of smaller and larger gatherings of ceremonies and services. I added this to the spiritual and ritual strategy to Lafin's list as being very significant to the Japanese prisoners. You can see that there are photos of Japanese men of different faiths. So in this case, this is a Tenrikyo memorial service, but men of various faiths, Christian, Buddhist, as well as the Tenrikyo were represented here. The same thing with the Christian service, where my grandfather was officiating. And this is a particularly interesting and significant photo because we have a Buddhist service for Mr. Nishizaki from the Big Island, and all of the Japanese, the Buddhist priests were lined up surrounding his casket. His son was brought in to attend this memorial service. The imaginative strategy, of course, was also very popular, involving the composition of poetry, writing plays, calligraphy, and so on. But poetry writing was a favorite pastime for some of the internees before the war, like Reverend Odate here on the right. As I said, he was a Buddhist minister, but he was also a writer of haiku. His daughter told me that he thought in haiku. And Mr. Soga was a journalist, and he and others wrote tanka, all of this before the war, and they continued the practice in the camps. These men published their work and that of others, in collections such as Kodama. Such publications were a testimony to their long-term purpose, their legacy, one that transcended the boundaries of the Santa Fe internment camp's barbed wire. Soga clearly states the purpose of this collection in his preface, and he states this collection to be both cultural, the purpose of this collection to be both cultural and political for posterity. And I'll just read you some of the lines here. After the onset of World War II, from Alaska in the north to Hawaii in the south, Japanese men from all stations and walks of life were incarcerated in this camp in Santa Fe. Although we are from different backgrounds and situations, we are alike in that we have been forced to abandon our homes, leave our families, and experience the trauma and indignity of living in a prison camp. The publication of this anthology, Kodama, is a demonstration to the world and future generations to come of the true Japanese spirit of Yamato Damashi, the strong Japanese character of calm in the face of unbearably harsh adversity. It is our hope that this effort will help to establish a peaceful world for future generations. So these were educated and highly literate men who made every effort to maintain their cultural identities and forms, to maintain their integrity and dignity, very deliberately in their writings. Their legacies were resistance, perseverance, resilience. And Soga captures the Issei desire for peace through calm strength. What then is our inheritance, or our inheritances? As much as the hundreds of Hawaii Issei and their American Japanese families wanted to forget those war years in order to survive and move on, this raises questions of remembering and forgetting. expressed also by Mr. Soga in this poem written during his internment. When the war is over, and after we are gone, who will visit this lonely grave in the wild where my friend lies buried? Who will remember him, them, their imprisoned presence, and how? This, I think, is our charge, our responsibility. It requires our learning, our knowing about what happened to them, and remembering. Descendants can give them peace, and we can find peace ourselves. But it also requires our vigilance, our not forgetting. And I see the Santa Fe internment camp marker as a kind of symbol of that. There's a whole story to this, which I can't get into. But it also requires this remembrance, this inheritance. It also requires our vigilance, not forgetting. The current social political climate revisits World War II racism in terms of anti-Japanese and anti-immigrant attitudes. We hear references made to the Alien Enemies Act of 1918 against immigrants incorrectly. We also have heard that the National Archives is whitewashing history and eliminating or passing over stories such as the Japanese American incarceration. While the attack on Pearl Harbor, to be commemorated tomorrow, was horrendous, we must be aware that the political backstory was very complicated. We need to know the historical layers in order to assess and recognize abuses of power in the present. This is why I refer to the many infamies of December 7th, 1941. Thank you.
Thank you so much for just that breadth of knowledge, that spotlight into all the stories that unfortunately are going. Well, this is already a story that I think I imagine is new to a lot of our folks in our audience today. And then just and even nowadays, I still find folks who aren't aware of the incarceration of Japanese in the United States after the Executive Order 9066. So this is an even deeper layer of truth that's not out there. So thank you so much for that. Just a quick question before we turn over to Gail. Someone asked, what was the name of the researcher that talked about the strategies for survival resistance?
Oh, John Lafton, he was a psychologist.
John Lafton. Thank you so much. But I want to turn it over to Allison now. Are you with us? There you are. You just gotta.
Okay, aloha.
Thank you.
So just so that all you know, I'm working off of my phone, so I have my computer on the side, and I'm going to be reading off the side.
Let me know
But
when
you can
you
go
get
ahead.
ready.
You can start the first slide. Thank you, Jose. Okay, so today I am focusing on the counter narratives, telling our own stories to uncover conflicting truths. Next slide. And I just wanted to say, ano ai ke aloha kako. Good morning and welcome. O wau no o Allison ka ōlinokaimana miyuki Yasuoka. Before starting, I wanted to share my positionality as a fourth, fifth generation settler Japanese. I call Waimalu the sheltered waters, are the waters that feed my ohana, and also feeds the aina of my place. Okay, although I'm not sharing about my work to care for Pu'uloa today, it is important and connected work nonetheless. I am very humbled to be here. I appreciate your taking the time to join us today and hope that at the end you will connect to what we share, possibly have questions that you would like to field. We welcome you to join the dialogue here today. Please feel free to enter your insights, your questions into the chat while I share my intergenerational stories with you. Next. So my first ancestor, Tsunekichi Itasaki, arrived in the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1891. He is my great-great-grandfather. He is part of the stories that I will share with you today. Although he passed away in 1943 at 82 years, it was thanks to my mother and aunt, who are both in their 80s, that I know who he is and how he fits into this intergenerational story. His decision to accept King Kalakaua invitation to work in Hawaii would forever change our family's trajectory. Next slide. Okay, my part of today's story sharing will focus on the sharing of counter-narratives to uncover conflicting truths. So here is a definition of counter-narrative from Millett and McCann's article on literacies and languages. Solorzano and Yosso define counter-narratives or counter-storytelling as a method of telling the stories of those people whose experiences are not often told, those on the margins of society. These narratives challenge the status quo by countering the dominant discourse and exposing and confronting racial privilege. Solorzano and Yosso delineate three specific types of counter-narratives: personal stories, stories of others, and composite stories. So today I will be focusing on the telling of personal stories, which are definitely influenced by the stories of others, shared by others, and can thus, in speculating, imagining aspects of also gone through a process of compositing. I would also like to bring the work of Carmen Maria Machado into our dialogue space because I'm inspired by her work on archival silences. I quote, "Archival silence illustrates a difficult truth. Sometimes stories are destroyed, and sometimes they are never uttered in the first place. Either way, something very large is irrevocably missing from our collective histories." Next slide, please. So across the globe, we are witnessing an increase in the silencing of marginalized voices. We cannot control what might happen. We cannot control what policies others may create, but we can make a choice to share our stories, to keep them front and center and refuse to be silenced. There's healing layered into the process of storytelling, time to slow down, making time to meet with and speak for extended periods with family. I also enjoy researching and reading the answering of the many questions going around in my mind. I find that very satisfying. Please share in the chat why you believe it's important for us to collect and share our family stories. Okay, next slide, please. So finding and putting together the pieces of the puzzle. My journey to learn more about this time in history was driven by the need to find the truth. And this is a process that takes time. It is like a puzzle and you're finding pieces along the journey. And I'm not going to say that it is easy or not time consuming, because it is. However, as someone who values diverse voices and someone who loves hearing about the not so distant past, I find great value in this process. It can feel overwhelming when you want to find more about your own story, when you have so little to work with. But what I have found on this personal journey is that as I heard or read other stories, it often provided leads on where to look next, what resource, what thread in the story I should target. And as you can see in the puzzle pieces, what I'm going to be covering today is the Macaulay fires, Issei arrests, research and building connections, and finding peace. And this is also an intergenerational storytelling. Next slide, please. So before I move into my family story, please consider this, whether it is connected to history, science, or the lives that we live, what happened in the past impacts the present and the future. The past is not disconnected from us. The past, even the distant past, have impacts on our lives. What did I gain from attempting to puzzle together my family's December 7th story? I learned about the trauma my mother's family experienced. I learned that the impacts never ended with the passing of the date. There are ongoing intergenerational impacts. These impacts are not necessarily tangible, but instead may be exhibited by a disconnection. For example, a disconnection to a relative, to a story, a veritable hole within a family's history. It also can be a disconnection to language, to ancestral religion and spirituality, and to cultural ties. Okay, my family did experience these, but I'm not going to go into great detail of that. I just wanted you to know that this is what I realized going through finding my family stories. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about my family's presence in the Macaulay fires on December 7th, 1941. Please, next slide, please. So I know that this looks a little complicated, but on the right side, the large photo is like a picture of the Macaulay area. It's in present day, a present day image. And then I tried to kind of zoom in on that little red square on the right, bottom right side of the screen. And I tried to blow up the block that did receive bombing, and it also had fires spread across the block. And if you look on at that one block area in red, in the yellow is where my Terada family home was. Okay. Let's see. There's also in the right-hand upper corner, you can see the Lunalilo bombing and fires. My family also always shared the two hand in hand, the Macaulay Block fire and the Lunalilo school fire. And two reasons for the significance is it is where my aunt and mom would eventually attend school. And it also was the designated site, a Red Cross first aid station site for the area. And that's how it was being used on that day. Okay. After Lunalilo School was bombed, patients that were being serviced were moved out under the coconut trees. So in this slide that you're looking at, right? Sorry, the next slide. So this next slide shows the top left image. You can see Macaulay Block fire damage. The lower left image is of the Miyamoto drugstore. So that the drugstore was on the corner of Macaulay and South King Street, and it received incendiary bombing, which made it catch on fire. And in the upper right, you can see Lunalilo school bombing. And the lower right image shows how the area was lined with coconut trees. So one of the issues with the Lunalilo fire is because there's so many civilian bombings and fires on at the same time, it was difficult for fire department to come right away. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so imagine how you might feel if you were witnessing this kind of carnage happening on the block you lived. If you feel so moved, you can record some thoughts in the chat. Several witnesses that shared their stories recounted how they felt at the moment of the civilian bombings. According to Hatsue Helen Hirata Yoshida, it was very scary for several days, she said. We didn't know where the bombs were going to fall. Flames destroyed 20 buildings in the retail district near her parents' store on Macaulay Street. They kept their lights off that night, huddled in fear, and later painted their windows black. Others covered their roofs with tar paper to block out all light. Helen Yoshida also provided an example of what was lost. Yoshida said she was grateful to live in Hawaii, where she didn't face as much discrimination as on the United States mainland, but Japanese Americans working for the military lost their jobs. And Yoshida said when she returned to business school in January, gas mask in hand, most of the Chinese and Korean students were absent. They had been hired to fill vacancies at Pearl Harbor. At her family store, where she stood to address her parents in Japanese, where she once used to address her parents in Japanese, she now began to call them mom and dad. So here we start to see the internal pressure to not appear to be too aligned with Japan or Japanese culture. Okay, next slide, please. So this is a more zoomed in shot of my mom's Terada family's home. And it miraculously, even if it was right in the midst of everything, it went unscathed. My 87-year-old aunt wanted to make it very clear. She said, our home was not nice. It didn't really feel safe or secure. It was kind of rickety. But because of the time, there wasn't a lot of crime. So we still felt safe. We shared our home with the Takabayashis. They lived on one side and we lived on the other. There was only one bathroom in the house, so we all shared it. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this image is of the third extra for the Honolulu Star Bulletin on that day, December 7th, 1941. And on the bottom left, it shows someone that did get injured on that day. Their residence was 944 McCully Street, and my family's residence was 940 McCully Street. So that's just how close my mom's home was to the bombings and the fires. Next slide, please. So after the McCully block fire, my mom said that the Kajihiro family came to take her family in. She shared with me that their home was near the Kapuiolani area. I asked her, do you know the first name of the Kajihiro? Hoping that I could trace it back to an address, but she said she did not know. However, researching has a way of bringing forth interesting discoveries. The interesting discovery that I made about this Kajihiro connection is that my mom's grandmother was a Kajihiro. Her name was Kashi Kajihiro, actually her great-grandmother. No, sorry, her grandmother, sorry, I got confused with that. Kashi Kajihiro was her maiden name. Thus, I believe it was actually family that took my mom's family in. But unfortunately, this familial connection was lost because she can't remember the first name of this Kajihiro family member. But still, we have great appreciation for this family. Next slide, please. So the issue with false narratives that spread on December 7th, 1941. One issue, the community was already dealing with a real bombardment situation. The next issue was that this added layer, the spreading of rumors and false narratives. There was the belief that it was the Imperial Japanese that were attacking civilians. This incited and intensified fear. It's difficult for everyone to get access to the truth in order to recalibrate and realign. Because if you think about back then, right, even if TVs were already invented, they really wasn't widespread, especially in Hawaii. That wasn't more until the 1950s, I believe. So when we're faced with fear, we go into fight or flight mode, which is not the best time to think about how to avoid fear-dominated xenophobia. Okay. So on the other hand, the truth can bring opportunities for healing and for finding of peace, inner peace. How can moments of peace strengthen our resolve to not feed into racism should a crisis arise? In the foreseeable future, we will need to make decisions to stand up against racism. Can we all make this commitment? And that's something you can think about. If you feel like you want to respond, please do so in the chat. Next slide, please. Some false stories that were shared on Hawaii's airwaves incited an intensified fear against the Nikkei, the Japanese Issei, Nissei, and Sansei. What we need to be mindful of in the future is that media often stirs up the pot, escalating matters versus de-escalating them. So there is always a need to be vigilant, to have patience, to wait and seek out validation, to vet the source. In Honolulu Magazine, writer Willis David Hoover shares, history has since definitively concluded the Japanese aim was the destruction of Oahu military targets as quickly as possible. There was no time, no need or purpose for targeting civilians. Likewise, there was no fifth column activity in Hawaii before, during, or after December 7, 1941. Enemy paratroopers never landed on Oahu. Saboteurs never poisoned local water supplies. Local magazine ads never included hidden messages, alerting conspirators when the attack would begin. Secret agents never taught specialized island dogs to bark in code. And so those were some of the rumors that were going around and that were spreading. So just to think about it, and you can respond this in the chat, what if there were less panic and fear after tragic events? How do we resist racism in the face of fear? How can we proactively prepare ourselves to resist xenophobic thoughts? Okay, next slide, please. Okay, civilian bombings and casualties. Misplaced blame on the country of Japan, when in reality it was the US military's friendly fire. Here is the Merriam-Webster definition of friendly fire: the firing of weapons from one's own forces or those of an ally, especially when resulting in the accidental death or injury of one's own personnel. And I also included it to extend it to civilian casualties. And unfortunately, a lot of times when civilians are injured or face mortal fates, they are considered collateral damage, and their deaths are minimized. According to Honolulu Magazine article, Historic researcher and writer Nanette Napoleon has documented 57 explosion sites in which the lives of dozens of children, women, and men ranging in age from 7 months to 67 years came to a tragic end throughout the day. Okay, so that's just a little window. You can definitely do further research on your own to see where more of these locations. I actually that's something I really want to look more into are these 57 explosion sites. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, warning, false narratives can have intergenerational impacts. In 2010, when my son was in the 7th grade, attending an immersion school in Kaneohe, one of the students came up to him during December and said to him, "Your ancestor killed my ancestor." Now, if you know 7th graders, the fact that my son came to me with this information is huge. I knew that he was telling me, "Mom, how do I deal with this?" And also in his eyes, I could see the unspoken question. Did my ancestor kill his ancestor? At the time, I only knew about December 7th, 1941, in accordance with the attack at Pearl Harbor. I didn't hear or read counter narratives, even know that they existed. I felt helpless and very uncomfortable at the same time. Uncomfortable that there was still an anti-Japanese sentiment that existed within communities, and it made me feel ever more distant from my own identifying with my Japanese heritage. Next slide, please. How sharing stories builds connections, grows understanding. What happened to my son always stayed at the back of my mind. Then, during the pandemic, I took a class from Kumukawai Kapuokalani Hewitt, where he shared about his extended Kaneohe family and how they go back for years and are part of the fabric of Kaneohe and He'eia. So when he started to share about how on December 7th, 1941, four of his family members lost their lives while making their way to Pearl Harbor, I listened intently. And when he shared that initially they thought that it was Japanese that shot up the cars, but recently learned that it was actually friendly fire, suddenly all the pieces began to fit together. The Haumana, the student who passionately believed that my son's ancestor killed his ancestor, believed this because of the perpetuation of a false narrative. It really goes to show the power and energy false narratives have, where they can live on for years without ever being corrected. My Kumu's sharing of his family's story went on to impact our own family's story. In this way, his story was a powerful connector. It built up rather than destroyed, and it had the capacity to bring peace and healing. There are more people who have alternate narratives to share than we realize. Do you have a story to share? So the next slide, I just want to announce a trigger warning because I'm not sure if it will trigger anything in any of you. But if you think it might, just please close your eyes and I'm going to move on to the next slide. And the next slide, this is an image that shows the devastating effects of the incendiary friendly fire bombs that went off. I did cover sensitive parts of the photo so that just out of respect, but I did want to show it, although because you can see the effects on this car is very impactful. Yeah, these are the same kind of bombs that blew out windows, spread shrapnel, ignited fires throughout Oahu. I also wanted to make sure that my Kumu's family's names are never forgotten. So the 4 family members that lost their lives was Joseph Adams and his son John Adams, David Koho'okele, and his uncle Joseph McCabe Sr. Next slide, please. Okay, taking the time to process everything is key. Go through the emotions, sit with them, and for me, I like to make sense of them through writing. Documenting the stories together with how you're experiencing them is important. There is no one right way. It could be through art, poetry, music, writing, oral storytelling, etc. Here is an excerpt from an autobiographical piece I am writing for my English 311 class. I'm addressing my grandma as though I'm having a conversation with her. But grandma, you also knew how war had a tendency to distort and twist everything. No matter how strong one's beliefs were, it was not enough to stop others from blurring the lines of morality, not enough to stop others from choosing injustices, from choosing to commit atrocities, from choosing to be racist. Always feeling justified, but murder is murder, isn't it? Isn't justifying it in any way, shape, or form hypocrisy? And so this is a process that I go through just to write what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling, and try to connect it with my grandma who meant so much to me. Next slide, please. So circling back to my great-grandfather, Giichi Tamura, I attended Dr. Gail Okawa's Remembering Our Grandfather's Exile book talk at Hamilton Library in 2022. This triggered me to start seeking answers about my great-grandfather's incarceration. Gail's work helped me to find tangible documents connected to his unjust arrest that placed him into a context of place and time. This 9th transfer group document allowed me to see who my great-grandfather took the journey to Santa Fe with. So before Santa Fe, they also all went together to Sharp Park Detention Station. Okay, she also has a petition to return to Hawaii. It's not depicted here, but she did share about it. And I will concur that the first time I saw my grandfather's signature on that petition, it was extremely moving for me. And it just made me realize, like, because I'm in education, but it made me realize that physical handwriting with a pen or a pencil, and for your later ancestors, your later descendants to see that, it is very powerful. Just to encourage all of you to continue writing. Next slide, please. The Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii's Interning Directory allowed me to see the complete journey that my grandfather took after he was unjustly apprehended in January 1943. And I really encourage that even if you don't think you have a relative who was sent to a concentration camp site during World War II, search in this directory to know for sure. Because I did meet someone on one of Gail Okawa's other talks. She did not think that any of her relatives were ever incarcerated or interned. And then I looked on the interning directory with her, and sure enough, one of her family members was incarcerated. So it's a great, it's very easy to access as long as you know at least the last name of a person. It'll list all the people that were incarcerated with that last name. So my grandfather's journey, he was arrested January 1943. So his journey is really unlike Gail's and other internees that were arrested immediately on December 7th, 1941. My grandfather wasn't arrested until January 1943, and I have tried to think about reasons for that. He then was sent to Sand Island internment camp and Honouliuli internment camp, and he was on the 9th transfer group boat out on July 1943. Their first destination was Shark Park Detention Station in California, and then they were sent to Santa Fe internment camp in New Mexico as of August 1943 until October 1945. And then he didn't return to Hawaii until November 1945. Next slide, please. So another important resource in filling the gaps in my great-grandfather's story, his internment story, was thanks to Gail. She told me that I needed to actually, if I had a chance, I needed to go to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. I think, or was it in Virginia as well? I only made it to the Washington, D.C. one because my daughter had a fellowship that she needed to attend to. So it was a kind of, how can I put it? It was the experience. It takes a while for them to find your files, and the way that people treat you there is not necessarily a way that you might feel like you might get treated there. But in the end, the fact that I was able to acquire some documents that I otherwise would never have seen was very valuable. So if you look in the left-hand side, you can see how my great-grandfather Giichi Tamura was treated like a prisoner. His photo was taken in a mugshot format, and he was fingerprinted. And at the top of the document, it's labeled alien, enemy, or prisoner of war. On the right side, I was also able to find long-lost familial connections to the National Archives. So if you look at that name that's kind of circled with red, it says Tame or Tane Tamura, I'm sorry, Takabayashi. That's Giichi Tamura's sister. And if you remember my story before, my mom's family lived with the Takabayashis during the Makali fires. And come to find out that's actually my great-grandfather's sister. And I believe that information has been lost to my family. So I am going to share that with them because I just found that out when as I was going through my documents. Next slide, please. Okay, I wanted to end with an imagined writing to my grandma because she is a very important part of this contra narrative. From wanting to manifest peace by naming my mom Hiromi because she didn't want the war to cross the Pacific Ocean, to her spirit, energy, demeanor, and way of existing in this world, it all pointed to her wish for peace and harmony to prevail. So I really feel like she herself, even if she's Japanese, even if she's Kibe, she actually went to Japan and was educated there, and then returned to Hawaii. She still, in her heart, did not want to have war. So for until the bitter end, women like you would stand strong, would not waver, for they knew the one thing they did have control over was their family, was love. Grandma, after all these years, even after you have been gone long, you continue to inspire me. Your strong, unwavering heart of compassion, your strong, unwavering support of our community, your strong, unwavering hold onto your identity. You owned it. When the mighty winds came to knock you over, you remained strong. When biases and assumptions, racism ran rampant, tried to hammer you down, to weaken you in attempts to make you falter, you held your ground. You continued your Shinto faith. You led followers of peace and gratitude at Seichonoye. You continued to speak Japanese, to proudly wear your kimono, to practice ikebana and chanoyu, green tea ceremony. You resisted assimilation, resisted acculturation. You held on tight to our ancestral heritage. And I know you hoped that we would find our way home. And my final slide. Sorry, I get a little emotional talking about my grandma because I always am so inspired by her. And just to end with mahalo nui loa, thank you all for joining us today. I would really love for you to reach out to me, so I left my email here. If you have any additional questions that pop up or any thoughts you wanted to share after the presentation. But I'll hand it over to José now. And also, I think Gail also wanted to say some final things.
Thank you. I just have to say thank you to both of you, not only for Gail really just kind of introduced the stories, took us down a little bit of a history, bring light, honor, respect to the ancestors. It's one thing to say we carry our ancestors, it's another thing to literally showcase to all of us and educate us and truly keep their stories alive, their spirits alive. Allison, I loved all the intricacies, taking us on your own journey and the questions you provided and how I felt like I was in class. I felt like I was in class with both of you. So thank you so much for that. This is more than what I gathered for. I it it's an ongoing journey. It's an ongoing journey as we try to really reclaim those stories. And it's unfortunate that we have to use the word reclaim because they've so been like forgotten and hidden or just lost as time goes on. But I know that you talked about your son, and I imagine Gail as well with younger generations. I imagine they're so thankful that for the work that you're all doing. So thank you for that. I am going through just to see if there were any questions I may have missed before I have anything specific. Just a lot of wonderful comments thanking you, blessing you all, deep appreciation. Stories matter. A person's voice is a more important tool for change. Thank you for sharing these family stories of their truth, what they know. Humble knowing these lives. Someone talked about their great aunt worked them on Cully and walked by a group of boys who were killed in front of the corner drugstore that was hit. Just it's so important to this is why I do what I do and showcase the power of storytelling. I guess one question I would have is just I know you've been inspired at different stages of your lives to pursue these truths. Um, might you share not only just any words of wisdom for folks who have that lingering thought of like, I don't know a lot about my ancestry, but I would love to dig deeper about it. I mean, you provided a couple tips of like different to areas for research. Obviously, going to your current family members is key. But was there anything nuanced that you learned along the process that you didn't think to look there that you would share with us today?
I can go ahead first. One of the things that really helped me was there's so this was kind of controversial in that in 1940 there was a census taken of the Hawaii residents, and because of that, every resident's address was well known to the government, um, and like it documents like all your neighbors and everything. So I didn't pay ancestry.com to get all the neighbor information. But if you so desire to do that, maybe eventually I might end up doing that because they're making it harder and harder to access information. But at one time, you could actually get all of those different censuses. So if I found one name, I could look up their name during that time period, 1940 census, and it would show all the people that lived in the household, and it would also give their address. So that is actually how I was able to validate whatever my mom was telling me. Like if she said, "Oh yeah, the Colburns lived on the corner of McCully Street and Algaroba," I could Google their name, and then their census would come up, and I could see all the residents that live there. The same thing with the Takabayashis. I could see who lived in there, and that's how I knew that that was actually the sister of my great grandmother. Um, so I think that is actually a good place to start. Although I feel like Ancestry.com has made it harder now to access that information. Um, but I believe I'm not sure if there's another site that where you can still get that. I know the archives, if you go to the National Archives, they have a partnership with Ancestry.com, so you can actually look up as many things as you want to. So go there already knowing what you want to look up if you don't want to do the monthly payment um, plan for that. Uh, and I think that's kind of where I started. But definitely, like I think a lot of families have things that they don't even know, like just kind of how Gail found things. And I think that's kind of my worst fear is that people might not even know that they're in possession of something that is so historical, and then it ends up getting thrown out or something like that, you know. So I would say like if you have if you know of any existence of these kind of things, to please send it to like a archive, like Hawaii State Archives or Japanese Cultural Center of Hawaii, or to the University of Hawaii Library to see if they would be able to preserve it in some way if you yourself don't want to go through it. I'm sure Gail has a ton of ideas on how to get started. So I'll pass it over to Gail.
Well, actually, I'd like to make a little commercial announcement for a group that kind of grew out of, I guess, one of my book talks. But I had a slide just before the last one of the Santa Fe internment camp marker. I don't know, Jose, if it's possible for me to show that.
Yeah,
Is
yeah,
it?
yeah. You can still share screen. Yeah, most definitely.
Okay, let me see if I can do that. Um, Whoops, I don't know what's going on here. Okay.
If you like, in the meantime, we have a couple of questions. Oh, you have it there, right there. Never mind. You have it up.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention is that and this was going to be it was kind of an extension of my talk, is, that descendants and people who are related to descendants and people who are not necessarily descendants of the Issei themselves, but who are interested in this whole history. There are all kinds of things that can be done to remember the story. So I just made a kind of quick list of some of the things that have been done. But I wanted to make a plug for the one at the very bottom, because if there are people who are interested, who are descendants, and who are interested in pursuing this, just understanding what happened in their own family, they could join us. Okay, we have developed, after I gave a talk at the Plantation Village in Waipahu, we developed a kind of talk story group of descendants, and then out of that came a pilgrimage to the Big Island, and so on and so forth. So, we have a very nice group. I'm going to ask Naomi if she can also share her grandfather's story. But this is one of the things that has come out of it, is that once you start talking to each other, you can share resources like Allison just mentioned. And it's just amazing how many connections we actually find. One story leads to another story, one relative leads to another relative. We find out that people are actually related, as Allison was saying. And so I think the human connection of people being a part of a group and developing a community story is very important. But the reason I mentioned these other, I wanted to show the slide to you, is that these are different ways in which we've been making efforts to remember the Issei, remember the details, as well as the larger part of the story. So, for example, the Santa Fe internment camp marker that I showed to you, I don't know if I can get that in the next slide here. Oh, yeah. So this actually, there's a big story associated with the establishment of this marker, because there was a great deal of controversy over it in the 90s. And that is a whole story that I tell in my book, but also there is a film now made by Claudia Katayanagi, which documents the controversy itself and how it was resolved so that this marker could be built, because there was a great deal of struggle in the community of Santa Fe. There were internee families, as well as allies and historians, who felt that there needed to be at least an acknowledgement of the fact that this huge internment camp was on the outskirts of Santa Fe. That got completely wiped out by a subdivision. And so there was this huge controversy in the late 90s, and an effort to raise funds as well from people of different descendant groups, different descendant families. And eventually the vote in the city council was tied. So that's part of the controversy. And the mayor had the courage to vote in favor of the establishment of the marker. So this is why I feel that this has become a kind of symbol of both our memory of the Santa Fe internment camp, Issei, as well as our responsibility, for vigilance of the whole historical, the whole story, the history, but also how it's relevant to the present. But this is one of the things that we were able to establish, and I was able to go to the dedication of that marker. And that inspired me to propose both the 10th and 20th anniversary commemorations of that marker in 2012 and 2022. So that's the relationship there. But related to the recognition of the marker, of the history that the marker symbolized, the New Mexico History Museum actually has a very small exhibit, which Annette and Gary, when they went on their pilgrimage, were able to document and show me that it still exists, because it includes the cross that my grandfather used in the services that he held in the camp, in the Santa Fe internment camp. In addition to that, we have Confinement in the Land of Enchantment Project, which is a whole nother story in itself. My book finally came out in 2020 after 18 years. But the Angel Island, some of you may be familiar with Angel Island, which was the entryway to all immigrants from the Pacific, as well as other areas, but certainly from the Pacific. Does have a permanent exhibit called Taken from Their Families. I have photos of all of these kinds of things, and I was going to present them. I can still present them if people are interested. And then a Generational Legacies traveling exhibit, which we used for the 20th anniversary in 2022. That you may be familiar with the Irecho, the Book of Names that Duncan Ryukan Williams has put together. It's at the Japanese American National Museum. I can just show you a couple of those slides. This was the pilgrimage that we held after the symposium, on the same day as the symposium, and dedicated the marker. This made a dedication to the souls of the Issei, represented by the marker. And this is Angel Island. And the stories of the Issei, in this case, Reverend Fujitani, actually has been highlighted. These stories have been highlighted. Some of it drawn from my book. But I did want to invite people to connect with us. You can do this through Allison or me, or José if you need to get in touch with me. And we would be happy to work with you in terms of finding out other things about your own family. So I think the storytelling, as Allison has said, breeds more stories, and we are able to reconnect and connect so many different ways. And I know there are different people on the in the audience who may want to share. Can I ask Naomi to is she there? Yeah. Can you please share your grandfather's story, because he was the one who had the attitude and also the ability to express himself regarding the barbed wire disease. Can you help us to understand what happened with him?
All right. I know, Gail, that when we initially talked about this session, you did mention that you would like me to talk about how he was picked up. So I think I will start with that.
Yes.
As Gail mentioned, my grandfather was a Japanese school teacher. He was a principal of a very small Japanese school in Glenwood on the Big Island, where I grew up. And we believe that my grandfather was targeted for various reasons. One is that. The other is that he had a small business, which still is in existence. He ran a store. And The other one is because he was a subconsular agent. He lived in a community with, at that time, many Japanese families. And he was asked by the Japanese government to serve as the agent for his community, since he was able to, well, there were mainly farmers in his community and dairy farmers. And as you know, immigrants from Japan at that time arrived to work on plantations, and many of them were not literate. And so these men who were picked up, as Gail said, were those who were educated. They were, they were literate, and that's probably one of the reasons they were selected. But because my grandfather was able to, was literate in Japanese as well as some English, he was asked to do the job that the Japanese government asked him to do, which was purely voluntary, by the way. And for those three main reasons, I believe that my grandfather was targeted. And as Gail mentioned, he was obviously on the list that was put together earlier that summer of someone they should pick up. So in the case of my grandfather, he was behind the store. It was very busy that morning on December 7th, because as soon as his neighbors found out about the Pearl Harbor attack on Oahu, they all came rushing to the store to stock up. And the Japanese all came to buy bags of rice, and there were also a lot of Portuguese in the neighborhood, and they came to buy flour, and the store was very, very busy. So my grandfather was having a very late lunch, probably about 3 or so, behind the store. In the old days, those mom and pop stores had the store in front, and then the family lived in the back. So he was having lunch back there, and the story goes that the MPs, the military police, and the local police captain, who actually my grandfather knew quite well, barged in through the store and came up into the kitchen and just told him, "Hirano, you got to come with us." And so he was allowed to take one coat, and my grandmother and my father and one of my father's sisters, had no idea what was going on. And I think my dad told Gail, when Gail interviewed my dad, that it was one of the saddest days of his life. Probably one of the most confusing days too. But they had no idea where they were going to take them. They said that he was taken into this black police car, and they had no idea where he was going, whether he was ever coming back. But they did see that the car was headed toward Volcano. My family lives in Glenwood, which is just about 10 miles away from a Volcano, where the Kilauea military camp is. So because it was headed in that direction, my dad said they just assumed that that's where he was going. And a few weeks later, they found out that he actually was there, because my grandmother then received a call asking her to pack a suitcase of warm clothing. And she could not drive. So my father drove her to KMC, Kilauea Military Camp. And my dad said that when they got to the camp, it was just, all they saw was a lot of soldiers, just all over the place. They were escorted to a room where my grandfather was, and they were allowed to speak with him. However, my father and grandmother were too afraid to say anything, and they were not going to risk speaking in Japanese. So so they spoke just a few words in English. They were very afraid because there were two MPs just standing outside the door listening to them. So they had a short visit, and they returned back to Glenwood. And so I know that was a very traumatic experience for the three of them on that day. And so in regards to the barbed wire reference that my grandfather had made in his journal that actually Gail discovered, and I had not known about it until I read Gail's book, and and she told me a little bit more about it. And when I think about it, it made what he had written exemplified really who I knew my grandfather to be. He was an educator, so I think it made perfect sense that he would list all of the courses that he was able to take at the internment camp. I also, and this is purely my thought, he was on transfer boat 2, which included other people from the Big Island, including Mr. Oshima, who was from Kona, and he was the one who tried to escape from, I believe it was Fort Livingston, right, Gail?
Fort Sill.
Fort
Sill, Oklahoma.
Okay, so it was very early in their experience because my grandfather's group, Transfer Boat 2, went first to Oklahoma and then to Louisiana, then to Fort Missoula in Montana, and then to Santa Fe. So it was very early in that journey for them. And I think my grandfather must have known Mr. Oshima because they were both from the same island. They were both storekeepers, and he must have witnessed or heard about that experience of Mr. Oshima trying to escape from the internment camp, because I believe that he was a victim of the barbed wire disease.
Yes.
I think this is, again, my interpretation of why grandfather was so determined to not succumb to the disease, because he had seen his friend succumb to it. And
yes, Naomi, I think that's a very important point, because yes, this is described actually by Mr. Ozaki in his book, and I think I have a quotation, I have the description, I believe it was from Mr. Ozaki's book, in my book as well. But Mr. Oshima is one of those casualties, quote unquote, of the anxiety, the terrible fear, and that went along with all of this. And I think it's very easy when you just read a history book to sort of gloss over the realities of the experience, which is why I'm so glad you were able to share your grandfather's story, because we have nothing in our family in terms of what actually happened on that day to him when he was picked up. So we can kind of imagine, because they were picked up in the same region, right? The same locality, Ola not being that far from Glenwood. So it's very possible that some of the same people could have been involved in the arrest. But certainly they both ended up at the Kilauea military camp. And, so sometimes it helps if you have no story at all. It helps to know other people's stories, and you can kind of fill in gaps. But I think in the case of Mr. Oshima, who must have been known not only to your grandfather, but to Mr. Kato and the people from Kona, as well as the other people from the Big Island, certainly because they were all locked up at KMC they would have gotten to know each other. And those who were sent out on the second transfer boat, who went to Fort Sill and then Livingston, some people were sent up to Missoula, not all, but the others were sent directly to Santa Fe. So, and then those who went to Missoula, like your grandfather, eventually ended up in Santa Fe. But I think, the different camps had different kinds of pressures. Fort Sill was a military camp, and they were treated very differently in the military camps, the Army camps, as opposed to the final camp they went to, the Santa Fe internment camp, which was run by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS. So I think all of these subtle differences or not so subtle differences have to be taken into account when we start putting the stories together. But we can do that more easily when we're talking to each other. So thank you.
Can I say one more thing? Because we know Jose very well, and we know Jose because Hiromi Peterson, who is also on this on this Zoom, and I have been working practically our whole careers trying to promote peace education in the youth. And I think that through her story, her family story of her family's experience in Hiroshima, and my grandfather's story about his internment experience, we have been trying to share the importance of telling these stories, learning these family stories to promote peace, that none of this can happen again. And all of us, every family has been affected in some way. And if we know these stories and can preserve these stories and can share these stories with the youth and have them continue to tell the stories to the following generations, perhaps there is a little hope for peace. And Gail and Jose, if you don't mind, because we're talking about sharing the stories with the youth, I would like to call on my niece, Sheridan Sano, who is a student at West Oahu College. And she, went to the Big Island with us. She admires Dr. Gail, and I asked her to say a few words to Gail, if you don't mind. So Sheridan, are you there? Sheridan, are you there?
Hello.
Yeah. Can
So
you
if you can just say,
video?
I don't know.
We can't see you. Can you turn your video on?
I know
I can try. My camera's been bugging like halfway through the semester. Can you see me?
No.
Where are you?
I'm in front of the camera.
No, we can't see you.
No, we can't. That's okay. Just
sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, what did you speak about the camp? About the trip?
Well, no, just talk about what you've learned so far about your great-grandfather and how you think that it has formed your thoughts now about war and peace.
Well, for me personally, I'm the only, I guess, great-granddaughter that's still living on the Hawaiian Islands. Like both my sister and my cousin are both in Boston, and if they decide to stay out there, I'd be the only one still here and connected to the land and the history behind Pearl Harbor, World War II, and the internment camp. And with war and peace, it's with everything that's going on now, even with like the recent election and just everyone trying to voice their thoughts and feelings about it. I feel like as a country and as a community, we've become even more divided when we should be coming together, learning from history that not everyone is the same, but should be treated with the same respect and decency, no matter the color of their skin or ethnicity or religion.
Thank you.
Totally
you.
agree. And this is one of the points I did want to make, is that the more we understand what really happened on days like December 7th, this is just an example, but the more we understand all of the different layers of events that occurred and the number of people who were affected in so many different ways, the more, hopefully, the more alert we can become to the things that are going on around us today. You know, and we can, it helps us to also understand the different kinds of political issues that are working behind the scenes, because our families were affected by those very kinds of machinations. So I just wanted to say that December 7th, which we're going to be commemorating tomorrow, you know, is an extremely important historical event in American history, but we need to know the broader story, because that is my main project in the future. And so I invite anybody who's interested in working with us in telling these stories or uncovering these stories. And going back to the idea that Allison brought out, the more we know, the more we can value even in our basements, in our you know, on our walls, in our basements, in our attics, in terms of things that our ancestors left behind, that help us to tell the story. And so we're trying to gather things, gather people, gather information, and hopefully expand the story as we're doing this. You know, one bit at a time, one family at a time. And that's I think it's a real challenge, but it's a really exciting prospect when we meet new people. So I'd like to, again, invite you all, and if there are any other questions, please feel free to either ask them privately through an email, or throw them out in the chat, or bring them out right now. Go ahead, whatever.
Yeah, we actually have a Clifford who's had his hand up for some time, so I want to give him a moment to share questions or comments. Please go right ahead.
Okay, I'm Clifford Nishimura, and although my wife Edna's grandparents, a grandfather, was sent to Santa Fe, and I guess he was interned for about 3.5 years. I just want to make some remarks not connected to that, because I just wrapping up a biography of my parents and maternal and paternal grandparents. Just wrapped up, or more or less wrapped up, a biography of them, and then sent the drafts to my my brothers and my sister for review. And we've been talking more than ever on the phone after I sent those the draft out to them, and they had some corrections about my understanding of what happened. Like, it wasn't my grandparents. They were not. You know, my grandmother wasn't actually a picture bride. Actually, my grandfather and grandmother, they were first cousins. You know, and so we're learning a lot about what really happened, based on the memories of my older siblings. And my father actually was summoned to the federal building in Hilo, third floor of the federal building in Hilo. That's where the people who were arrested were taken to be questioned. But apparently he wasn't well, he was not arrested. He was summoned for questioning, and I think they wanted to ask him about the geography of southern Japan, where they were planning an invasion. But in any case, writing this biography, I really brought the siblings together with their memories, and I think it's an important document because my father was a Issei, and naturally my grandparents on both sides were also Issei, and it's so I think what I'm writing, I've never done anything like this before. I think it's going to be an important document for whoever comes after us in the family. And I did talk to somebody at the Japanese culture in Hilo. There's a Japanese
Hawaii Japanese Center.
Hawaii Japanese Center. I talked to them about something else, and then I said, "Oh, after I'm done with this biography." Well, my parents lived in Hilo, and my grandparents all lived on the Big Island for most of their adult lives. So they said, "Yeah, they'll be happy to receive a copy of the biography." So I encourage everybody, whatever you know about your ancestors, try and collect information and put something together, because it's going to be something of value in coming generations. I think that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I noticed that Connie, is she still here?
No, she had to go. But have you
Oh.
met Connie? She's really wonderful. Her and her husband Kent did some really good work. It's another book, another talk story, and I can share that recording with you another time too.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that uh, Connie Matsumoto is the wife of Kent Matsumoto, and the two of them wrote a book called, is it On of White Ashes or something like that? It's on here, I
White
think.
Ashes, yes, yes.
Yeah. And there's an interesting, well, as I mentioned, I specifically mentioned her, actually Kent's mother, Reiko, was one of the first people I talked to in Washington, in the Washington area, in Virginia. And when I was doing my research at the Smithsonian and at the archives, and it was her story about her father was picked up on Kauai. He was a Higashi Honganji minister, and he was picked up on that day. Actually, it was the next day. It was December 8th, because Kauai didn't have enough FBI agents, I guess, to act fast enough. So most of the Kauai people, Kauai Issei, who were picked up on the 8th instead of the 7th. But her mother-in-law, Reiko, was the one who introduced me to my first Issei survivor, Reverend Akahoshi, who happened to be visiting his children in Virginia. So, this is what I mean when I say that one meeting could lead to so many others and so many precious stories, but I was hoping that Connie might be able to enlighten us a little bit more about her mother-in-law. But also, she mentioned to me in an email that they did not have Reverend Odate's his poetry, which her mother-in-law shared with me. So in the same way that Naomi doesn't have yet, hasn't uncovered her grandfather's folder, which had his information about barbed wire disease, his notes about barbed wire disease. Sometimes researchers can just happen, because they happen to be there at the right time, happen to collect information, and if that can also play a part in the restoration of family stories. So again, I think that it just is inspiring to be talking to so many people who might be interested in this topic.
I completely agree, Gail. And Clifford, thank you so much also for sharing. And um it is, I think this is the first step, right? To collect all those stories, if you can get it published or, self-publish it, because, I think I know future generations will definitely value that. And even not blood related generations, because as it turns out, there's lots of Gail's stories connected her to Naomi and Allison, and it's just been a domino effect of beautiful connections. And it's thank you. Thank you for the lessons learned, the ongoing journey that you're going with, and we look forward to continuing this with you all. I think as I look through the chat, a lot of wonderful comments. I'm saving it for you all, and I'll send it to you so you can read it a little later too. I know someone did ask about how has the National Archives been changing history. Allison responded a bit about that. There was actually Densho published an article about how the National Archives has recently been whitewashing ugly histories,
Right.
just the Japanese American incarceration. So, and that's just one spotlight. So we don't know what else is out there. So as we talk about, reaching out to the National Archives to be able to do some of our research, I encourage folks to do it sooner than later because we don't know what may be available there. But don't lose hope because there's all these beautiful storytellers all around us and that are keeping those stories alive, whether it's through print, through oral histories. Now we have, recordings and digital media. So please, continue to stay connected, elevate those voices, especially those that have gone unheard for way too long. Greatly appreciate you all. I don't know if Allison or Gail, you have any final words you want to leave us off with? You've already provided us so much wisdom, but just want to give you the floor one last time in case there's anything else. But I just want to thank you both for the bottom of my heart for everything today and everything you're continuing to do. Thank you.
Allison, go first.
Yeah, no, just thank you everyone for giving us your time and for being so engaged with us. Your interest in this is very inspiring as well. But we can't wait to hear your stories as well. So feel free to reach out to us. Jose can also share our emails if you weren't able to record them. Thank you so much, Jose. Thanks, Gail.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Again, I think the interest, the stories that you all have already that you may have shared, but also the interest that I see into the comments in the chat. I'm very interested in Gail Takashira's comment about asking about women. And this is a conversation we might want to have separately. If you can get in touch with me by email. But this is an open door, right? And so I want to thank Jose again and thank Allison and everyone who has attended for your input. Any follow-up you can send to me gyokawa@yahoo.com. And, hopefully we can connect you. If you are descendants, you might want to join our Hawaii Connections group. But I'm also trying to develop a larger group that includes the mainland people. I haven't gotten there yet. But we did have a Tadaima session, I think it was last year. And we do have some people who joined in that conversation. So that is another step to come in the future. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Bye.
Gail, Just for folks who are listening to this recording, there was a question that thank you for pointing it out, Gail, about we've been talking a lot about grandfathers or men, not so much about women who were incarcerated. It was mentioned that the only folks incarcerated in Hawaii were men, and so that's why I think a lot of the focus today has been on that. But I think there's definitely more stories to share, and we look forward to as we get those together, bringing those to you all.
Actually, let me just say
Please,
this
yeah.
much, Jose. There were 8 women who were sent out as well, but again, very limited. The focus was on the males, the Issei males. And so most of the work that has been done, if anything, has been on the Issei men. But I am very interested, and I mentioned this in my book as one of those things that we need to do yet, and that is to look at the 8 Issei women who were also incarcerated in Texas. So that's just another project.
And I look forward to seeing how it evolves. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful, beautiful weekend. Look forward to
Thank
connecting.
you.
Take care.